We're on.
Much late.
Do the big introduction.
Greetings, everyone. How are you doing? How's everybody doing this fine?
Shalom.
Pretty good.
Shabbat shalom. We've got a lot of exciting stuff going on. We're going to continue a talk we had last week concerning Judaic traditions, religious and secular. And should a Gentile be doing them, a Gentile follower of Yah? Should they not? Is it half and half? Is it 20-80? Is it 80-20? Or 0-100, 100-0? There's a lot of different ways to come at this. And of course, everybody in here is probably coming at it from a different standpoint, which is always fun. But we also had another exciting excursion on the think tank concerning Hanukkah. And so usually we'll just take the flavor of the week and try to break it down here. But I think what we'll do is we'll continue our discussion on traditions, although that could be part of them, but overall. And then maybe next week, maybe we could do a little something about Hanukkah. I know that we could have, two opposing sides present their views and then everybody chop them up, the good stuff. So, but just a recap last week, and I might let Scott, after I do a little recap, just start out with a general overview of kind of, where he lands and why he lands there. I was actually, I don't know if you guys are following Jackson on, what is it, the Beanstalk podcast now? What has he got going? Podbean?
Podbean.
Yeah, something like that. Jackson and the Beanstalk. And he's got a new podcast going there, and that's where he's going to start putting his stuff. So I followed him, and he's thrown up some of the stuff that he had before. He actually threw up a Hanukkah one before this, I think this thing came about on the think tank. But also he was just talking in general as a side note, I think, on one of the podcasts about, how that the so-called Hebrew roots is not really Hebrew roots, it's Jewish roots, because they're trying kind of like to do a lot of the customs of the Jews. And I thought that was just an interesting thing to say as a side note in one of the podcasts. It had nothing to do with the topic. But anyway, so how we went last week was we were talking about different traditions. Should they be followed? And then why, if they should be followed, why should they be followed? But in general, I guess maybe I could start out by asking you, Scott, do you, and we said this a little bit last week, do you see the modern day Sanhedrin as an authority that should be followed by Jews and or Gentiles? And if so, how do you reconcile that with them rejecting Yeshua as the Messiah?
Okay, first of all, the Sanhedrin, as an official body, never rejected Yeshua as the Messiah. They just left it open. There was discussion. There were some people that believed, some that didn't. There's some evidence that a couple of the rabbis who helped to found the Haggadah, the telling of the story for Pesach, were believers. Some had varying beliefs, such as that Yeshua fulfilled the role of Messiah ben Yosef, but he still has yet to fulfill the role of Messiah ben David. There's all different sects. They're all allowed to make their opinions, and it was basically left open. The modern day Sanhedrin is what's called a nascent Sanhedrin. In other words, they have no power. They haven't been accepted by the majority of the people. So what they're doing is just getting set up, just testing, but they have no authority today. So basically, any rulings by the Sanhedrin were closed and final until a new Sanhedrin is fully accepted by the majority of the Jewish people in the land of Israel. So really today they have no power. They can't make any decrees. They can't change anything. They can't rescind anything by the previous Sanhedrin until it's fully valid. And so that's where we stand today.
Okay, so then I guess the question would be, what is your take on them when they say something? I'm assuming, I don't know. I'm assuming they're giving out some sort of directives or some sort of, at least some sort of doctrinal stances or something like this. Is that true? And then how do you take those?
I'm not really following your question totally. What they're The Nascent Sanhedrin knows there's problems with a calculated calendar, and that's just one example. And so what they're doing today is putting things on the table that they feel need to be changed due to more information, but that can't be done until they receive that authority. And part of it is that the different sects of Judaism all have to agree first that it'll be a legitimate Sanhedrin that represents all of the people. And
what are the sects of Judaism that would be large enough to be included in that group that they would have to all agree?
It's going to be, you have your Lubavitchers, your Chabad, you're going to need the majority of all of these major groups to agree.
All of the major Orthodox groups.
Yes, and they also will be able to have representatives that represent each of those sects sitting on the Sanhedrin with agreement by all of the other Orthodox groups that these guys are qualified scholars and that they are all looking for the benefit of the Jewish people as a whole and not just their individual sect.
Sure. So then would a Karaite Jewish leader be considered? Would a Messianic Jewish leader be considered?
That's a possibility. It's not closed to any of those groups, provided that they, are acceptable and their scholarship is known. They will be allowed to represent and voice their opinions, and that's exactly what the Mishnah does. And especially the Gemara of the Talmud, the Mishnah is the basis of the Talmud. The rest is commentary. It's called Gemara. And so all of the groups are allowed to express their opinions. Then if it comes down to it, they can all argue. Then there will be a vote. And then they vote, and the Sanhedrin would have to vote to make any decrees or changes. But it all has to, if you make a decree or a change, it has to have backing in the Torah. In other words, you have to recite a verse. Now then it comes down to interpretation of that verse. And so that's why all arguments are able to be presented. And a lot of times they just say there's not enough information or you don't have enough Torah backing, so we cannot make any changes or decrees.
Got it. Does anybody else have any questions for Scott real quick before we move on?
Yes, I do. Just one. So per your opening, you said that the Sanhedrin as a whole did not reject Yeshua as the Mashiach. Now, the body that put Yeshua on trial, what was that body? Because it gives you to appear that it may have been a Sanhedrin type body. Was it something else? And can you cite such a thing?
Okay, yeah. A lot of the Bibles that you have, there's subtitles and chapters and all of that. And it says, something says, Jesus appears before the Sanhedrin. Obviously that's not in the original text. That's just somebody's opinion. But it's subtle. It puts in our mind that Yeshua actually appeared before a Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin in that day could only meet in the House of Hewn Stone, which was a section in the southeast corner of the temple. And so any of those trials were already invalid. They can only meet in the daytime, not on a festival, not on a Shabbat. And anybody could go in and listen to the court, and it had to be a full-seated court. So it's pretty obvious that these trials of Yeshua occurred in the house of the Sadducean priest. It occurred at nighttime. Those are all rules that are laid down for the Sanhedrin that are very clear in the Mishnah that, those other trials could not have been a Sanhedrin whatsoever. Now,
so identify that body for us, Scott. What was that body that tried Yeshua?
It was basically a kangaroo court. Now, there may have been a few Sadducees who were members of the court, but they knew that they weren't meeting as a full body legally. In other words, it couldn't have been a Sanhedrin. It's just impossible. Just the fact they're meeting outside the temple, it's already invalid to make any death sentence or there's no way you can make a decree outside the temple building itself for death sentences. You cannot meet at night. The trials clearly in the Gospels, what we call the Gospels, occurred at night outside of the temple, and it was never a full body of the Sanhedrin that condemned him. In fact, later on, you see members of the Sanhedrin that are very careful. Even in Acts, it has Gamliel. He's saying, be very careful about condemning these people, that just because they're a different sect, if it's meant to fail, it'll fail. But he said, if it's something of God, we won't be able to stop it. So the Sanhedrin was very careful the official Sanhedrin was very careful in following Torah.
I've got a question.
Sure.
I just throw this out to anybody, but it requires speculation about today. And that is, why is it that so many Messianics are so desirous of joining with these rabbinical Jews who actually many of them despise, whom we call the Messiah, and when they really know that there's no way they'll ever get in with them? What's the draw there?
I could answer that if you don't mind, Jack, and if you don't mind, guys. What the problem is, and Jack, you kind of helped to bring this about with a lot of your teachings and understandings. But most people, when they come out of church into this truth, they only understand that it is Jewish in culture, Jewish in nature. So they go towards that not knowing what they're looking for. Because truth be told, when the 10 tribes went into captivity, we lost everything. So we had no identity, we had no customs, we had no culture, we had nothing. So when you say you want to go back to the Hebrew roots of our faith, the only thing that is identifiable, the only thing that is understood is that is left by rabbinic Judaism. So people who love Israel, who love the culture, they really grasp a hold of that, but they don't understand that, there's more to it, that we do have Messianic forefathers. We do have a Messianic history. We did not lose, because that's what they understand, that we don't have a history. We don't have a culture. We don't have a foundation. We lost.
Well,
So they go ahead. I'm sorry.
If it's true that some 90% of Ashkenazi Jews have not a bit of real Jewish blood, that they're all converts too, it boils down to the fact that there are a couple of sects of Judaism, like the Orthodox, Chabad now, and what's the other one, the liberal one, Reform.
Reconstructionists.
Yeah, what was my question? They're not going to take you in, and even if they do, you're a second-class citizen. Even, the people that I've known that have tried as Gentiles to be in to go into Orthodox Judaism are, including myself, rejects. We can't get in. Now there's this B'nai Joseph movement where some Gentiles are trying to become Jews. I don't know how that's ever going to happen. They're never going to be accepted, are they?
Hey, Jack.
Yeah.
There is a Daniel and I know some people here in the Cleveland, Chattanooga, Georgia area. They went to Messianic congregations for a long time. Then they went to the conservative Jewish congregation here in town, and they converted. They were accepted, and apparently they did not have to give up their belief in Yeshua. So I don't know what's up with that. I don't understand it all myself.
Some will accept. They're usually really careful. There's a period of time of conversion. They want to make sure you're serious. They try to discourage you on purpose to test to see if you truly want to believe. More and more of the Orthodox are saying, well, if you believe Yeshua is Messiah ben Joseph, you know, that's not our point. Are you Torah observant? Are you serious? And they purposely try to discourage converts so that they know you're really serious if you hang in there. And it's a period of time, and it depends on the sect.
That's just what I was saying. I mean, they will be rejected. I heard that.
Oh, yeah.
It's they give them 3 times, and anything they can find to be rejected. But you see, the power to be called a Jew these days is held by certain denominations. It's a club.
Oh, yeah.
It's a club, and it seems to me like with the Jewish traditions that we are not accustomed to, that are not necessarily Torah, but maybe oral Torah or Talmudic or Mishnaic, we're not going to find those followable because they're completely out of our culture. Yet we are just as much in every way Jews as the Ashkenazis are.
What I think, Jack, is happening is there's a human need. There's a human need to belong.
Yes.
To something. Many of us, when we were in the church and we realized that the church lied to us, we wanted to go. People wanted to go back to what they knew to be the roots of the originality. And when they look at this couple that Governor and I know that converted to Rabbinic Judaism, they'll tell you that a lot of the organizations to which we belong, they don't have a communal structure. They don't have structure in many cases at all. They don't have provisions to take care of their children, to nurture their children, to teach their children, to raise their children up. Oftentimes when the children get 18, they leave, that's it. And these families are struggling with trying to hold this stuff together because a lot of these people, they've given up in the congregations and they're meeting at home and stuff like that, but they know that that can't last long. So they're reaching out to anything that is communal, and what people are seeking is community. That's the bottom dollar right there. People are seeking community. People are seeking fellowship. Men are seeking other men to hang out with and learn from and be instructed with and by. And you don't find that in our movement. And that's why these people are running to Rabbinic Judaism. When I left from down South Florida, when I was down in South Florida, that was almost a temptation. You sit there and you look at these people. It's like, these people have community. These people have order. These people have things that they are doing in the local community. And when you look back at us, it's like, we don't see that. So that's the draw. That's the temptation.
Yes, that's the same reason that was given for the outstanding growth of the Assemblies of God and the Mormons as well, was the community rather than really what they believed. And So yes, that's certainly a concern. But what about all these people, like me, for instance, that I'm not looking for? That I don't need. I don't have children anymore. They're all grown up. I'm not married. I don't want to. I don't like crowds. Seems like there's a lot of people like that, and seems like there would be an organization that would kind of cater to that crowd as well, but there isn't. In fact, I've heard of friends of ours in the local Yahad here that have been pretty much shunned from the Messianic assemblies in this area if they were single. One guy talked about being thought of as a child molester because he went into the congregation, he'd gone there many times, and he said hello to the children, and he's a friendly guy. And they were so suspicious of him because he was an old man, he wasn't married anymore, his kids were all grown, that they put him out. But then that's his word too.
Well, there is
ahead.
somebody who made a kind of a statement. He said, "I'm the only person in the congregation that's not below 12 and unmarried." So there is a big thing about family in most of these congregations. I don't know what the answer is and how you would have something that could deal with everything, because there are families who want to be part of the Yahad too, though. So you've got I don't know if it's a catch-22 or what. Actually, I don't think it is, but that's just what comes to mind.
What we need to do is to go back and look at this thing and see it how Yahweh sees it. If you notice that a lot of the people that are going towards rabbinic Judaism are males. A lot of the people that are going towards the rabbinic Judaism are families, and they don't see, like you said, Jack, they don't, the Messianics and the Hebrew roots, they don't value single people at all. And so single people would be more apt to go towards rabbinic Judaism or even Islam. And that's something we've not put into this picture as well, that these people are looking for a place to belong to. They're looking for a place to be accepted. And so we have to go back to the Bible and see what the community looked like in the Bible, in the Torah, and in the first century, in the book of Acts. And it really did include all. So that's what I think that we should be striving towards is, Yahweh uses existential forces to shape our thought on things. And sometimes he'll say he used Babylon to bring down Jerusalem. He used Rome to bring down Jerusalem. Why? Because they were not fulfilling the mission that he had for Clone Israel. And so my thought is that when you look at the people that are fleeing for rabbinic Judaism or fleeing towards how just locking themselves in their houses with the covers over their head and the shades pulled down, we need to figure out, why is that happening?
Well, here's the way I look at it, and I'm coming from, being Jewish or whatever. I know that why would a Gentile, if he obeys the part of the Torah that applies to him, that's part of the problem, is not knowing what part applies to him and what part applies to the Jewish people. Why does he want to take on more commandments that he doesn't need to take on, provided he's Torah observant, he worships the one true God? What's the reason for conversion other than to there's no advantage to being Jewish, really. In fact, there's more responsibility. There's more commandments that apply. If a Gentile wants to keep all of the Torah that applies to a Jew, great, he can do it, but he's not required to. So unless he wants to marry a Jewish person, what's the sense in conversion? There's no advantage. Just because the Jewish people are called the chosen people, they're just chosen through their customs and what they do to teach the rest of the world about Hashem or about God himself. I'm perfectly happy if a Gentile should remain a Gentile, a woman's going to remain a woman, a man's going to remain a man. If you're a Cohen, you have laws that apply to you. Why do you want to take on more things that don't apply? If you want to learn about them, observe as much of the Torah as you want, but you're not required to observe everything. I mean, 271 of the commandments out of the 613 supposed that you can find in the scripture apply only if there's a standing temple. So right there's almost half the commandments that even the Jewish people can't keep today because there is no temple. So you have to understand what applies to whom in what situation. And we don't know that. We don't know the Torah well enough, and the Jewish people do, I believe.
Last week. And so I would, again, ask this question because I asked it last week, and maybe other people can chime in as well. It's not just for you. But I guess it'd be like a threefold thing here. Number one is why, as a believer in Elohim, why am I looking to do the minimum? That would be my first question. Why is someone looking to just do the minimum? Oh, you're not required to do that. Hey, I'm only required not to steal from somebody. But guess what? The Messiah says, but why don't you go give to the poor, right? I'm only required not to murder. And he says, guess what? Yeah, you probably shouldn't hate your brother in your heart also. So Yeshua automatically comes in and says, stop looking at the minimum requirement. There's a spirit that you live by, which the minimums, if you're just looking to do minimums, do I want you in my life for eternity? The second question would be, what does that mean the Gentiles are only required to do such and such? To what end is what I asked last week. To what end? To be in good standing on the earth with Elohim, in this temporal condition, but you still don't get eternal life because you didn't do what was necessary for eternal life, or you're good for eternal life if you just do the minimum? I think that's an important question. And then number three is, why then this whole time, even before Yeshua was had come down to the earth and was born, was the whole idea about joining to the children of Israel. So there was the mixed multitude that joined with Israel in and crossing the desert and going into the promised land. There were different groups, there were different individuals out of the heathen groups that decided to follow Yah. And when they did, they took off the things of those heathen groups and started to take on the things of Israel, i.e. David's grandmother. And also that's what, half of the book of Acts is about, is what is required and what does it take for them to join Israel. When you look at the gates in Revelation, they are named after the 12 tribes of Israel. And so implied, or at least I infer, that you need to be a part of one of those tribes so you can walk through that gate. So why are we trying to keep Elohim fears out of being identified with Israel? And then that leads us to the broader question that's brought us here today. What is required and what is not? What is just tradition and what is not? What should we embrace as being a Torah from Yah for all, and what shouldn't we? But I think those are pertinent questions. I think, Scott, every time you explain the Orthodox view, I think you explain it very well. But I think you also agree with it, and I disagree that you should agree with it, because it's very condescending in the sense that it presupposes, even though you said, hey, the Jews are only the chosen people to show the light to the world, the stance that you take presupposes more than that by taking that stance, if that makes any sense.
Let me take a stab at some of this, and people can get in here if you want to. When it says that we don't have to do the Torah or all of the Torah, I agree with perception that the temple has fallen. I believe that those things we can't do right now, but I do believe, listen, there's one Torah for the native, and there's one Torah for the stranger. That means I believe that we're responsible for doing what we can do. Now, as for the minimalist point of view on this, I don't believe that we can do the minimum. Now, I know if you're new and if you're starting out and you're being discipled, you learn line upon line, precept upon precept, and you keep moving forward. But at the end of the day, our goal is to be full-blown Torah observant. That includes the Shabbat. That includes how we eat. That includes the celebrating of the Moedim and other things. So, I believe that the Father was faithful. See, when he sent Yeshua to this earth, the Bible says he prepared him a body, and he came down and he did his earthly ministry, and he died. He lay in the heart of the earth for 3 days. He rose from the dead. Okay. Yahweh did not give us the minimum. He gave us his best. He gave us his best. And by such, I think that it's our job to give our best as much as we can to serve Yahweh. Now, going to Acts 15, and it talks about the things that you need to do for table fellowship. I believe that this was the minimum. That means you don't stop there. This is where you start to begin to have table fellowship. Is that you don't eat anything straight sacrificed and dedicated to idols. You don't commit adultery. You don't do thus and so. And this is one of the reasons why I don't go to Chinese restaurants anymore. I've had to repent for that because I used to love Chinese restaurants. And I don't go there anymore because they have idols there. They have altars there. And you're eating foods that have been dedicated to idols.
Find the Christians, man. You got to find a Christian Chinese. Come on now.
Well, the Christian Chinese is called make it at your house. That's what we do here. We used to do that. Me and Governor used to do that. But, the Father showed us that, this is things that we should not be doing because of that. Now, there are some Chinese places where they don't have those things dedicated to idols, but where they are, we as believers should not be there. So those are the minimum things to start. That's the start point to begin to have table fellowship. So that's my thought on it.
Well, absolutely. Those the four categories, the four decrees. It says that, Shaul was there, and you have the brother of Yeshua, and it says all the elders were there, and they met. And they said, what are we going to do about these rules of the Gentiles? And, of course, you had the edicts, the 18 edicts of the school of Shammai that was being forced upon the people, even though the Sanhedrin had never made a declaration. But that was forcing the non-Jews to not be able to come into the kingdom at all or join with the Jewish people in the synagogues. And so the school of Hillel opposed that and later on rescinded anything that the Sanhedrin had made mistakes on, saying, hey, the Gentiles have their place in the kingdom. And so they set down these four categories of commandments. It's just like the 10 commandments are categories. They're not only the commandments. Okay, so you have 365 negative commandments. Even if I don't do anything that the Torah proclaims, I'm at 0. And so the positive commandments are more mitzvot, like such as observing the festivals and all of those things. The Gentiles should try to keep as many of those as they can because they're good deeds, and those are the type of things that you can do as many as you want, but you're not required to do all of them as a Gentile or as a priest or as a Levite or as a male or as a female. You have to figure out which apply to you. And so just as you had mentioned in Acts 15, a lot of people read those four categories of commandments, and of course, they didn't just arbitrarily pick them. They looked in Yehezkel or Ezekiel chapter 33, and he's listing them all there. So they went back to the Torah, said, what's the minimum categories of commandments that you people can come in and have table fellowship, just as you had mentioned, and that's where you're going to start. And of course, a lot of people don't read 15:21, because then he continues on. He says, for Moshe of old time, in every city, those which believe, they come to the synagogues every Shabbat to learn more of the good deeds and things that they can do. Now, so if I keep 100% of the Torah that applies to me as a Jew, I'm at zero. And where God always expected me to be from the beginning. So now it becomes a matter of the heart that I'm going to go out and do these good deeds, or I'm going to go beyond the minimum requirements so that I can go beyond zero. Because the Torah doesn't save us, it only leads us towards the righteousness. So my definition of Torah is instruction in the righteousness of God and His Messiah. That's my definition. So the more of the Torah I know, it doesn't matter if it only applies to a priest or a Levite or to a halakhically Jewish person or to a Gentile. I need to know it all, but I don't have to keep all of it myself personally, because not all of it applies to me. But if I see in the Torah where it says the king must write the Torah in his own handwriting, I should be able to know that and provide him the paper, the ink, the pen, so that he can keep the portion of the Torah that he is commanded to do. I don't have to write the Torah in my own handwriting. So, you know, that's the basics of how I see it.
I have a question. My audio is bad. I don't know if you can hear me very
No,
well.
you sound great.
Okay. It's in regards to who is a Gentile and why we still call believers Gentiles. I don't think I'm a Gentile. I translate that Gentile as meaning non-believer. So I don't think anybody on this call right now is a Gentile. Once you believe and have faith, I believe that you are no longer a Gentile. You're only a Gentile if you don't know the Elohim of Israel. And that's how I see it. What are your
Well,
thoughts
you have
on
to be careful on that. Here's what the Jewish people, and then somebody else can chime in and give their opinion. But the Jewish people will say, basically, everybody's pagan, but if they start to follow the Torah, they worship the one true God, there's a name, and I'll just give it in English, but it's a stranger in the gates. And so you are elevated. You've done away with the idolatry. See, you're already observing what the early church, one of those four categories. You're putting away the sexual immorality. You are getting rid of your idolatry, and you're going to eat the minimum kosher standards so that you can have a covenant meal with the Jewish people. And so you're called a stranger in the gates. And so now you're to go and learn the rest of the Torah. And so you are correct in your determination that, you know, we can use the term Gentile, but it's too broad of a category. And so the Jewish people have a name for those who want to join with the house of Israel in what they need to observe that portion of the Torah. And so you'd be called a stranger in the gates, which is a way higher elevation than just being what's called Gentile.
So, as we look at the term Enochian Judaism or Essene, how does that look in the broader picture? Because let's say most of the people on this call, we believe in the term Enochian Judaism or Essenism, and that, from what I understand, as a matter of fact, I was looking up the other day. I listened to a lot of Dr. Shimon Irons's history lectures on Tuesday nights. And in that, he described the Sanhedrin, and one of those people that was on the Sanhedrin was a person called Menachem the Essene.
Yes.
That tells me that the Essenes at some point had dealings on the Sanhedrin, and they had a seat at the table.
Yes.
Tell us what do you know about that, and how does that now change things, being that we have taken on that construct or those confines?
Okay, actually, first of all, there's 10 levels of what we call sanctification or kedusha, and actually that Dead Sea area has a little bit higher of a level of sanctification than other portions of just Israel in general. And so it's interesting. The Essenes were a good sect in Israel, and they tried everything they could to return the people back to the Torah. And so I have a great respect for those Essenes. Menachem lived, in the BCE era, and he was actually the Av Beit Din, which has the highest power of the Sanhedrin, but he's not the Nasi, because the president of the Sanhedrin cannot vote unless there's a tie. So the Av Beit Din was held by Menachem the Essene. There's even a gate to Jerusalem called the Essene Gate. The Essenes continued to, at that time, tried to do everything they could to keep the temple pure, and they came against more and more obstruction by the Sadducees, and then the Sadducees also tried to use the group called the Sicarii. And so you have even one of the Sicarii is one of the chosen ones by Yeshua. He turned against Yeshua, of course. You could even see the name Sicara, Judas Iscariot. It's Judas HaSicari. So Yeshua chose people from every group. He chose a Levite. He chose a Pharisee. He chose a Shammai school. He chose a Sicarii. He chose an Essene. Yeshua, you could buy a book that says Jesus the Pharisee or Jesus the Essene. Everybody wants to claim Yeshua was with their group. I believe he specifically chose all the groups because every group had its good, every group had its bad. He didn't identify specifically with any one particular group. He's saying, hey, it's beyond a name or a title or an identification. So now you have to go back and look at, hey, the Shammai Pharisees had some good things to say. In fact, it's believed Yeshua's brother actually was of the school of Shammai until he actually realized that his own half-brother was the Messiah. Then he backed off on some of the problems with the school of Shammai. The school of Hillel, Yeshua agreed with him on 99% of the school of Hillel's doctrine, but you see Yeshua, he disagrees with him on marriage and sides with the school of Shammai. The Essenes, it was a great idea. Hey, let's return the temple back to it. But the problem is do you run off into the wilderness and just stay there, or do you continue to try to return the temple and the people to the Torah? So every group has its good aspects. Every group has its bad aspects. I don't like a title at all. I mean, do I want to be called a Lubavitch or Jew? Or is it just that I want to see Hashem and his Torah go out to the entire world, whether you're Jew, Gentile, a Levite, a priest, a woman, a man? It doesn't matter to me. I don't need a title.
So I have a question, and somebody can answer this. So there is a lot being made of the fact that, as you go back to the ancient church, we're not talking about Protestants here, that there was some separation. So what was the intent, according to what people think, and maybe what some people have read historically, because we often say there was no intention of Yeshua creating the church, but it sure happened. And it would sound like that, there was a sense, maybe they resented the 10 levels of Kiddushah or something like that. And so they said, we're going to go do our own thing here. I don't know.
Let me chime in on that because that's something I study a little bit. So basically, you have two different aspects of this. You have the aspect of the separation of the Messianics from Judaism. And then on the other side, you have the aspect of the separation of the quote unquote derogatory term Judaizers among the Gentile church. So these kind of happened simultaneously, but the Jewish one happened quicker because of 70 and 135. AD or CE, whatever you want to call it nowadays. So a couple of good books on this are Who Was a Jew by Schiffman, and then Marcel Simon has a book. My daughter's talking in the background. Marcel Simon has a book in talking about first century Judaism, and then there's a couple of chapters in that book about Manim in particular. And so, hold on one second. So, I don't have my headphones today. I apologize. So, you have the group of, and we talked about this a little bit last week. You can look at the YouTube. It should be up. You have the group of Messianics in Judaism proper. I mean, not Orthodox Judaism, but just being Jews, that in the 1st and 2nd century slowly got squeezed out of the synagogue. Now, Scott's saying that the Sanhedrin did not make an official edict, but certainly there was a power play in the synagogues. And so at first, these Messianics that believed Yeshua was the Messiah were allowed to come. They would go to the synagogue. They could hold power, et cetera, et cetera. Then what they did was they started saying, okay, you can come, but you can't speak or do any of the readings or anything like this. You can't pray. And then they had to go to the back, and finally they were squeezed out altogether. And Schiffman does a great job in showing the information that we have. As far as the Gentile Christians, what happened was that the Roman Empire started doing a lot of persecution against Jews. And so what these Christians said is, hey, the Jews don't accept us because they were rejecting Messiah. And so we're here keeping Sabbath and doing some of these festivals, and we're going to get persecuted the more we look like Jews. And so they started saying, if anybody starts Judaizing, then they're going to be in trouble, and we're going to denounce you because we don't want to get persecuted. So they started doing away with the festivals. And then, of course, when there's an absence there, it will get replaced. And we see all the different festivals that are now replaced it. They started doing away with Shabbat. And even you can see that the Roman Catholic Church all the way through the 4th and 5th and 6th centuries is putting out edicts still trying to squash Shabbat observance among Gentile Christianity. But the majority of them did not celebrate Shabbat or observe Shabbat anymore. And then they started killing some of them and different things like that. So that is kind of how it happened. To me, the ones that's cringeworthy certainly is Shabbat, because it's one of the 10 commandments. In my mind, I don't know what everybody thinks about Scripture, and if it's inerrant, infallible, or inspired. And we've talked about that before on this forum. But even if you don't believe in the infallibility or inerrancy of the book of Acts, which I don't believe in either of those, I do believe that Acts 15, talking about the 4 things, those weren't the only 4. I think that the 10 were just given. I don't think that they were saying you can just do these 4.
They're all categories.
Without doing the 10. The 10 are just, that's given. That's what Yahwistic observance is. And so, for the Gentile church to do away with Shabbat, I think that was a big deal. A lot of people don't realize that the mentor of Luther, Karlstadt, advocated strongly for a Shabbat, advocated strongly that they should change it back to the 7th day instead of the 1st day. And while Luther agreed that it was the church that had decided to move it to the 1st day, to the Sunday, he did not feel that the Reformation would have been successful if he would have tried to do that. So he did not put that on the table.
Well, they're all category. Each of the 10 commandments are 10 categories of commandments. I mean, that's pretty obvious, because if you really look at in the 10 categories, just an example, you shall not steal. Technically, those are all death sentence commandments there, the negatives. And it really is, it's you shall not kidnap is the only death sentence. Well, kidnap is the highest form of theft. So you don't find an actual commandment until Leviticus 19 where you shall not steal items, or you shall not pilfer, you shall not change prices, you shall not have dishonest weights. Those are all contained within that commandment, you shall not steal. And so it's just listing the highest order of theft as kidnapping. That's how it's viewed. And it's the same way. Don't eat things strangled. It's the word there, I think in the Greek, it's panikton. And if you really study it out, you shall eat kosher meats, kosher slaughtered. I mean, so it's a category. It's not just, one simple statement. It's just like we have categories of laws. We have traffic laws. Well, you could talk about stop signs, speed limits, that you can't have less than a 4-horsepower motor on the highway. It's divided down into multiple things. So the 10 Commandments or those 4 commandments given to the Gentiles, those are categories.
Scott, do you have any reference that you could point us to that describes these categories in detail, a PDF or anything like that you could share in the chat or on the think tank?
One place that you can do that is, I think, Chabad.org. Go to the 613 commandments, and then they'll have references there that will show you the specific scriptures where these categories are explained in more detail. And of course, that's part of what the oral Torah does, is it breaks down into specific categories because there was still controversy. And, Deuteronomy 17 says, this is what establishes the validity of the Sanhedrin, is that if there's a controversy, then go to the court and there'll be a decision, and that you shall obey the decision of the court. You shall not veer to the right or to the left, because what they're going to do, the court is going to sit down and look at every bit of the scripture, argue it out, let every bit of testimony come forth, make a final decision as, hey, this is what you should do if you can't figure it out from the literal written Torah.
I might add, be careful with some of that stuff because some of it is sex specific. And of course you have to, chew the meat and spit out the bone.
That's where you get into like customs. You see, there's 5 levels of Jewish law. You have what's written in the written Torah, then you have what's in the rest of the Tanakh, such as the prophets or whatever. Then you have the decisions of the Sanhedrin. Then you have rabbinic commandments that are done, or fences that are put for specific situations to protect the people. And then the last or lowest level of Jewish law is called the customs. I think in Greek it's the word ethos. And different customs apply in different areas, such as if I go to one sect of Judaism, we have a separation of our different foods, such as milk and meat, and the minimum is 72 minutes. But if I go over to a Chabad's house, we have a separation of 2 hours. So if he comes to my house, he can wait 2 hours if that's his belief. If I go to his house, even though I say I'm only going to wait 72 minutes, I have to wait 2 hours if I'm at his house. Do you follow what I'm saying? In other words, the customs are the lowest level of law. So if I am in your domain, I must observe the minimum that he observes. But if he comes to my house, he may stay more strict according to his belief, but I don't have to. I hope that makes sense to you. It's sort of complex.
It's called the law of Fleshig.
I'm not familiar with that term, but customs are important because you can offend somebody not realizing it, but it's not a Torah commandment that applies everywhere at all times. Paul mentions that where they're accusing Paul, he says, we have been heard that you forsake Moshe, which means the Torah, through to the ethos, the customs. So it's giving you the highest level of Jewish law to the lowest there in the book of Acts that they're accusing Paul of. And it's assuming that you understand that there's all 5 levels of Jewish law are included in that statement. They're saying we're accusing you, or we've heard that you're not only forsaken Moses, but all the way down through to the customs. It assumes that you know that when you read the scripture. I think that's in Acts 15. It might be Acts 21.
All right. Anybody else got anything to say or questions or anything at all? We're right here kind of on the time limit.
One thing I wanted to mention is that, a lot of us think that because of Gentile Christianity, and what's weird is, here I'm Jewish and I have a Jewish on one side, but my father came from a Christian perspective. So I've seen both ways. There's advantages and disadvantages to coming at it from the Jewish point of view or the Gentile point of view, and we can each help each other out. When did the church really start? Well, Deuteronomy tells us that the church started at Mount Sinai, and it's the word kahal. But to a Gentile, we think church, well, that started in Acts chapter 2. But really, it's the assembly of anybody who believes that Hashem or, YHVH is the one true God and desires to worship him regardless of who you are. And so, really, when did the church start? It started at Mount Sinai.
Absolutely. I would think that, that's a whole nother topic.
Sure.
If you want to say church proper, Tyndale's Bible uses the word church twice, and both times it denotes a pagan gathering. So church is from the same word that we get the word circus from. But if you want to say assembly, kahal is what you're referring to. Ecclesia is the Greek word used for kahal. Kahal, of course, being the title of the book of Ecclesiastes is Kohelet, which is the what's it called? What's the noun verb? I can't think of the noun verb.
Well, he's the proclaimer.
Sure. Well, the Kohelet is the assembler or the leader of the assembly.
Correct.
I can't think. What is a noun verb in language? I can't think of the word. A verbing noun. Participle. Anyway, sorry. So you have kahal is the title of one of our books, and the Kohelet is the one that runs it. That being said, I would agree that it did start on Horeb and not necessarily.
Deuteronomy 18:16 is one of the verses that says, "In the day of the kahal."
Right. Yes, and that's not the only word for assembly either in Hebrew. There's also another word.
Right.
But that's
there's four.
There's kahal.
A dot.
A dot. Hey, Rich, can I address one more thing?
Yes, sir. Go ahead.
In your discussion last week, I think you had a very good discussion on Shabbat and the Shabbat observance. And we put up a poll last week, and in that poll, we talked about which do you think is something that we should be doing today. And, if I were to take that poll, I would think that it would be, the statutes talked about in Leviticus 3 and Exodus 12. And, I put up, so I sent something to Jackson in reference to buying and selling on the Shabbat. And that was the one in Nehemiah, right, Jack?
Mm-hmm.
I said that it was about buying and selling, and also you have Exodus 16 with regards to cooking and preparing. And my belief on the Shabbat is kind of not moderate or stringent, depending on who you ask. And I believe that that is something that, as believers, it's one of those things we have to get down, and not desire to do the minimal, as we talked about early in this section, because Yeshua did not give us, Yahweh did not give us the minimum. He gave us his best. And so when he says in the Ten Commandments to honor his Sabbath, his set apart day, I think that this does include not only work, but this talks about cooking. It talks about buying and selling. And I think that's something that these are things that we can do.
About cooking and buying and selling, if you could clarify, what talks about it?
Nehemiah talks about it, and Exodus 16 talks about cooking and preparing with regards to the manna. That's what that whole manna thing was about. It was teaching our forefathers a work ethic. It was teaching them how to work. It was teaching them about preparation. It was teaching them that, 6 days work is to be done, 7th day work is not to be done. You get a double portion on the 6th day you collect, and then on the 7th day, that you have, cook that you go bake today, and bake what you go bake today, and on tomorrow's the Shabbat. That next day is the Shabbat. So when I say buying and selling, you look at that passage on buying and selling, you can see that they had an issue. This was coming back from the exile. They had an issue with buying and selling and trading on the Sabbath day. That's why those people were around the wall, because they wanted to get in there so that they could trade and they could do commerce. So that's what I'm speaking of when I say.
Who had the issue?
Who had the issue?
In Nehemiah.
And then who had the issue?
Yeah.
Judah had the issue.
Well, I'm just saying the commandment came from Nehemiah. It didn't come from Yahweh.
But was not Nehemiah in the office of high priest?
No, Nehemiah was a governor. He was.
You sure he wasn't the priest?
I'm positive. He wasn't a priest. That's Ezra is the priest.
That's what I meant. I'm sorry. He was the scribe. He was the writer, I think, right?
Nehemiah was the
scribe, right?
Ezra wrote it, supposedly, and Nehemiah was the governor.
Even still, it wouldn't have found its way into our writings if this was not something that Yahweh approved of. You can disagree all you want to, but why is it there?
Ahead.
Because here's the problem. Here's the issue that we have. If we start tearing out things from the Bible that we don't like, then the next thing you know, we're going to end up just like the atheists and the agnostics.
That's called bibliolatry.
Yeah,
I don't worship the Bible, nor do I think.
No, I'm not. I'm not saying that it's. Okay. I'm not saying that it's infallible, nor is it inerrant. But I'm going to say that it's there for a reason.
Okay, so let me just challenge you then.
Go ahead.
On 2 points.
Okay.
One is, and we don't have time to go through the actual exercise, but as a point of focus, then my next question would be to you, what part isn't infallible and what part isn't inerrant? And then by your own argument, you would say that you would choose the things that you really just didn't want to follow.
Well, and that's what normal people do. That's exactly what people do.
Okay, well, you're in a catch-22 by your own argument with what you just said. The second thing is that we come from a strain of Christianity that is the most paganized strain of Christianity.
Yes, it is.
So then right now, if we're being completely objective, our book that we've been handed down is much more suspect than the strains of Christianity that didn't have as much pagan influence in them.
Such as
the Ethiopians.
Okay.
So what I'm saying is, do I think we're just supposed to go, shotgunning through the Bible and pull everything out we don't like?
No, you can't do that.
But to not put a critical eye to it and to say, well, hey, I don't believe it's inerrant or infallible, but you can't touch any of it, and you must do all of it, no matter what.
Or the best you can.
Okay, that is tantamount to saying that it's infallible and inerrant, even though you just said you didn't think it was. So it's a tautology.
I think that you can, there are some things like, let's think about this. Not cooking and buying and selling on the Shabbat, that's not really that hard. Okay? These are not things that you
we're talking about, though. We're talking about in general. I agree. You should do as much preparation as you possibly can.
Correct.
For the Shabbat. I mean, that makes absolute sense. But to say that the words that a governor or a scribe said in post-Babylon exile Judaism, and we're going to take those words, that person is on the fourth level of authority. Yeshua, one, Moshe being number two, the prophets who prophesy and it comes to pass and tell you to continue following Torah proper, number three, and then every other writer or scribe or poet or historian, they're in the fourth level there. So you're trying to take a fourth level person and put them at first level authority, and I disagree with that strongly.
Well, take profaning the Sabbath, as Scott said a little bit ago, is a corporal punishment. I mean, it's a death penalty.
Yes.
Is Yahweh consider a person worthy of death who goes to the drugstore or drives to see an old lady or something?
Now that's a different thing. Hold on now.
Oh, yeah? That's
a different thing, because what you're talking about now is acts of ministry.
Okay, look, I think that if you consider yourself a Levite or a full-time minister, then there's nothing, as long as you are doing ministry on Shabbat, there's nothing you can't do. But I also think that if you're staying in somebody else's house and they keep Shabbat in a way that maybe is more strict or less strict, if it's less strict, you can keep it your way. Nobody's going to care. If it's more strict, then you need to do what the people in the household do.
I agree with that.
I definitely agree with that. And Scott was just talking about that. What I'm saying is, let's say when it says do not work on the Shabbat, okay? It says 6 days you work, 7 days, but it doesn't mean you go do secular work on the Shabbat. You're right in what you're saying, but that doesn't mean.
I agree with that.
So I think that we've been saying the exact same thing.
Jackson agrees with the statement that he was right in what he was saying. I agree with that.
What I'm saying is that I'm thinking about people who are desperate to hold a job.
Okay.
Because they know they're not going to get any more, and they have to come in on Saturday whether they like it or not. My remedy has always been for that. That you pray to Yahweh to make a way for you to get out of that day. I've done that several times, and usually
I have as well.
Fired.
Well, but you know what though? I'll give you a testimony
and say hallelujah right out the door.
But you know what though? I'm gonna tell you something. I've been there. I used to work for the Marriott. They knew that I was Jewish because I told them at my interview. Don't you know they got me in there? And then once they got me in there, tried to get me to work on Saturdays, on Shabbats. I danced my fat behind right to the special transportation van with such glory because I knew that I was going to take a stand for the Father. And I told him, I said, now you listen here. You are not going to get me to work on the Shabbat. Well, I'd say, I'm firing you. You're fired. And I left. So let that be a testimony.
Well, if you're halakhically Jewish, you're Orthodox, you're a doctor, you're at a hospital, it has to do with life.
Exactly. That's a whole different thing altogether. Exactly.
A Jewish doctor. My wife just had surgery, and the doctor's there. He knew we were Jewish. He's got his seats. He's hanging out. He's working on the Shabbat because it has to do with life.
Exactly.
Because that takes precedence, and the Orthodox Jewish people know that.
Same thing with police, fire, military.
Now, if you are stuck working on the Shabbat, you go do your job. As soon as you come home, though, you better enter the Shabbat.
Oh, man.
Can I tell you a story?
a way to do that.
I want to tell you a story about Jerusalem. Some of you probably heard this, but it's a good story. My brother was living over in Jerusalem going to get his PhD, and he went to the main synagogue downtown every Shabbat, and he couldn't make any friends. Nobody talked to him. They knew who he was, despite his last name. And he went for 6 weeks or so, so he told me. And then one Shabbat, place was packed and the air conditioning went down. The breaker tripped.
Mm-hmm.
And it started getting hotter and hotter in there, and people started looking at him.
Oh, yeah.
And he got up and he went over there and flipped the breaker.
Yep.
And all of a sudden, he had friends everywhere. He was a goy boy here.
Right.
But
See,
everybody else is afraid, even in the service, to go turn that air back on.
Now, if that were me, they would have had to get their fans out, because I've heard of this happening in the United States as well. As a matter of fact, a friend of mine, he was rumored to have a Shabbos goy. And so the Messianic rabbi told me, said, you go and ask Rabbi Denberg if he has a Shabbos goy, somebody that drives his Mercedes-Benz, because he won't drive it. So I called him up in his office, and I said, Rabbi, I want to inform you about a rumor in the community. So he said, well, what's the rumor? I said, the rumor is that you have a Shabbos goy. He said, no, I don't need to let my wife drive my car.
You said that to him?
What? I asked, yes. Yes.
His wife was his Shabbat goy?
No. The rumor, the Messianic rabbi told me to go and ask Rabbi Denberg if he had a Shabbos goy, because apparently it's a rumor in town. So I went and I asked him, and he said, no, I don't have a Shabbos goy. And he said he won't even let his wife drive his car. He said, so I said, let me ask you this then. If you have what is a Shabbos goy? And so he explained it to me, and I told him the same thing I just told you guys. I said, you better hope that your lights never go out in your synagogue, because I, as a member of the nation of Israel, will sit right there and suffer with the rest of everybody. So
I'll give you the Orthodox point of view on that. Okay, first of all, the Orthodox Jewish people believe that there's 39 prohibitions that apply to you if you're halakhically Jewish that you can't do on the Shabbat, but a Gentile may do if he so chooses to do it, but he doesn't have to. So it's left up to the Gentile's free will. If the air conditioning, like Jackson said, goes out, and I, as a Gentile, would be sitting there, I could choose to go flip the switch, or I could choose not to. Now, a Jewish person cannot ask that Gentile to go do it, though, because that's also a prohibition. I can't say, hey, because you're a Gentile, you go flip the air conditioning. I can't. You cannot ask him to do it. He has to do it of his own free will. Do you understand that?
He said they all turned around and started looking at him.
That's dirty.
Because he'd be allowed to do it, but they couldn't say, will you do it?
Okay.
You understand?
Dirty.
Scott, I have a small question. For the Sanhedrin, are they the only ones that can blow the shofar for the Shemitah, however you say it?
Well, they're going to, people are going to check to make sure that they have said that this is the proper date, or this is, it is approved that you can do that. Now, obviously.
What if it's so far over time that they've never done it? It's extended the time. The time is longer than what it's been, and they haven't done it.
You mean for the Shemitah year, the 7-year cycle, or the Jubilee, or
7 year.
So what you're saying is, if they missed it, can they still proclaim it?
No, can anybody, or does only the Sanhedrin able to do it?
They can designate whoever they choose to proclaim it, but they must approve of the designation. Does that make sense to you?
Okay, I understand.
Just like the high priest, if he's commanded to do something, if it specifically says only the high priest can go into, say, the Kodesh HaKodeshim or the Holy of Holies, then he only may do it. But if the high priest is designated to do something and it doesn't specifically say, then only the high priest can designate another priest to do it in his stead.
Okay. Well, I'm not going to wait for someone in Israel to do it. I'm going to do it today. To blow the shofar. Because it will happen next week. Thank you, Scott.
Okay.
Yes,
Yeah.
I think that's a good idea considering what we were talking about earlier. Get out there and blow that thing.
No, go ahead. I don't want to do all the talking.
I had a question for Scott about the difference between laws that are applicable to Gentiles as opposed to Israel, I guess you would say. It says that there's one law for both the stranger and the native.
That's
and
correct.
Also says that you're to treat the stranger as a native. So if the same laws apply to both, do you have an example where the law says this is for Gentiles and this is for Israel? I thought the law was just for Israel, and that's why I thought Louisiette was bringing in once you're a believer, you're no longer a Gentile, because like Paul says, you were once Gentiles in the flesh, but now you're part of the Commonwealth, which kind of syncs up with this. Strangers are treated as native born, and they have one law.
Okay, what it means is that you don't have a different law for each group of people, that you have one law in the land of Israel and it applies equally to everybody. But does the law of having to immerse if you're a woman and you had your monthly cycle apply to men? But that's different. That's still one law, right?
If I pose the question, does the same law apply to men and women? I would say yes, it applies to men and women. The women don't do this, the men do this. But when you say Gentile or native, where is an example of a difference between the Gentile and natives and the laws that they have to keep or that apply to them? That's an example of between men and women, but I'm not talking about men and women. I'm talking about Gentiles and natives.
Okay, well, that was just an example. In other words, it's the same Torah, but not all of it applies to each person. I gave an example earlier. If you're the king of Israel, you have to write the Torah in your own handwriting. I'm not the king of Israel. I'm in the land, but that law is there.
Well, again, that's an example for a king versus someone who's not a king. I'm talking about an example for someone who's part of Israel versus a Gentile.
What if I have a driver's license so I can legally drive in Ohio or Florida or whatever state you are in. Now, I have no desire to drive a semi. I need a license to be able to drive a semi. So that law exists if I want to drive a semi, but I'm not going to do it. So I don't need that law, but it's still one law for the land. Do you follow what I'm saying?
Again, that's a different example. That's a worldly example with a worldly law. I'm talking about a Torah example for a Torah law or any kind of law from Torah that would say something different applies to Gentiles as it does to the stranger that sojourns among them.
Well, part of it is some of the laws only apply in the land of Israel. They don't apply if you're outside of the land of Israel. So now you have to know that.
Well, again, that doesn't have to do with who is an Israelite and who is a Gentile. That's where you're located. That has to do with the difference of where you're located. And
but more Torah laws apply if you're in the land of Israel.
Right, but I'm just saying a difference between what a Gentile would have to follow and what an Israelite would have to follow. Because if a Gentile is in Israel, he still has the same law, so there's really not a differentiation there like you're trying to pose. But I'm talking about if you have a Gentile and a native born, and they're standing side by side in the kingdom, what is different between what applies to each of them?
Okay, it's the same Torah, but you were born, it doesn't matter. If you were born a Jew, you observe all of the laws that apply to the Jew. It's not a different Torah. It's that you only have to minimally observe what applies to you as specifically who God created you as. What difference does it make? I mean, if I'm Jewish in the land of Israel and I have somebody who's Torah observant and they come into the land, they don't have to observe all of the things I do, but they have to observe the minimum. They're part of the kingdom. It applies. What specifically applies? In other words, you have to know all of the Torah. You can't just pick out a verse or pick out that one verse that says, there's one law. Well, now you have to learn the whole law. So what applies to me because I'm a Levite, whereas I need to collect the tithes of the people. But if I'm just of one of the tribes, not a Levite, I don't need to collect the tithes. But I know the Levite needs to collect the tithes because God designated him to collect the tithes. I'm not envious of him. If I'm not a priest, I can't go into the Azarah of the temple. I don't desire to go into the Azarah. That's his job. But I need to know that. I'm probably not understanding what you're trying to ask.
Well, all the examples you're giving me, they're not a difference between a Gentile and an Israelite. What you're saying right there is a difference between a Levite and a non-Levite. You're not really attacking the question that I'm actually asking. If you have a Gentile and an Israelite, if you have a native born and a stranger standing side by side in the kingdom, and they both, claim that Yahweh is their God and believe in the Messiah, I mean, can you give me any example of any law that would apply to one but not the other?
Yeah, if you can't own land, let's say, you have to be a member of the tribes to, have inherited land, okay? So if you're a Gentile and you don't own any land, then you don't have to pay any tithes. You don't raise any crops. You don't do any of that. So, but you're liable to everything else, but you're not a farmer. You don't have to pay tithes. Tithing is never money.
So maybe let me ask this a different way. Who is a Gentile?
Well, then you're back to that question, a Gentile can mean just a worldly person, or are you a stranger in the gates? You want to join with Israel and be part of the Commonwealth. Big difference.
And the reason I ask that is because you or other people keep referring to us as Gentiles, and I have a problem with that.
It'd be 10 tribers, Lewis said.
Yeah.
10 tribers? Okay.
But if you're a member of one of the 10 tribes, it's pretty hard to prove. I mean, just like Ashkenazi Jews, you can say, well, how do they know they're Jewish? Because they chose to be that way. And so is it a matter of DNA or is it a matter of the heart?
Right. So I don't think that we don't know. And even if we did, it didn't matter. Once we belong, we belong. We have accepted Torah. We observe it the best we can. I don't think that we should be considered Gentiles. So the fact that we keep referring to us as Gentiles, especially in this group, I strongly disagree, and I think maybe we should rephrase that.
How about this?
You're correct.
Let me throw this in.
You're a member of the Commonwealth of Israel.
There you go. You got it. He answered it. Because I was going to say, what about this? Anybody that has said all that Yahweh has said we will do, they become part of the covenant. And that's really the end of that.
What's interesting about that statement, all that he says we will do, they hadn't even received it yet. They said, we believe your God so much, no matter what you say, we're going to do it and keep it. And of course, none of us can physically do it, except the Messiah was the only one that could.
Well, the phrase that all he has said we will do, we have to say now because all that it could have been said. Probably the translation doesn't work, but all you have said we can do, we will do. Because as you said, there are things that we can't do. Just as a matter of fact thing, because a woman can't do what's for a man, and a man can't do what's for a woman, and so on and so forth.
And you can't keep 271 of the Torah commandments unless you have a temple, so you can't even do it.
Well, it doesn't make you a Gentile because you can't keep
Lady, man. Oh,
the priest, what the priest does, or that doesn't make you a Gentile just because you're not a priest, you can't do what the priest does, or that doesn't make you a Gentile.
No.
And Scott, I had a comment on your example that you gave that was about the land. Isn't the promise for Abraham that his descendants will inherit the land? And if we're descendants of Abraham, we're seeds of Abraham. It's not just the ones that physically are his offspring, but the ones who are of faith. Then don't we also have promises of land in that covenant?
It's possible, but do you know that? I think basically what you see, I think it's at the end of the book of Yehezkel. No, it's at the end of the book of Isaiah. It says that when the Messiah comes, he will choose out of all the peoples those who don't even know that they're a Levite or a priest or part of Israel. The Messiah is going to have that knowledge. So you may or may not be appointed land, but the entire world, there's going to be other nations during that millennial kingdom, and they'll be given land there, and they're part of the Commonwealth of Israel. And you're welcome to come into the land of Israel. In fact, you'll be required to come up for Sukkot, actually all the Shalosh Regulim, the 3-foot festivals. So you'll be required, if you're a male, during the millennial kingdom to go up for the week of Hag HaMatzah, which includes Pesach or Passover. You'll be required to come for Shavuot or send a representative in your stead and for Sukkot.
Well,
So,
I always saw it as anyone that was heirs to the promise and was given this incorruptible body in the end, that those are the citizens of the New Jerusalem. And yes, there will be Egypt and there will be nations that will have to come up, but they're not actually part of that promise of the covenant, as those nations wouldn't be made incorruptible like the citizens of New Jerusalem will be.
well, New Jerusalem, I believe, obviously there's a physical Jerusalem and then there's a spiritual Jerusalem. So the millennial kingdom will be a physical fulfillment of those promises. The New Jerusalem, I believe, is in the Olam Haba after the millennium is over. There's going to be no need for a temple anymore because there's no need for instruction because they will all know me. And that's Jeremiah 31. So you're going to have a physical fulfillment. You're going to have a Sabbath rest of 1,000 years to literally fulfill the commandments. But then after that time, there's really no difference between Jew and Gentile. We won't need a physical temple. You won't need a physical Jerusalem. So there's going to be a physical fulfillment first, and then there's a spiritual fulfillment. And so the New Jerusalem, it's here now, but not yet. Just like you're in the kingdom now, but the kingdom isn't fully here. Not everyone knows Hashem. And so it's not here yet, but it already exists in the spiritual realm. It hasn't been fully realized in the physical yet, which must come first, then the spiritual comes.
So do you think we're already in the millennial reign then? The day of the
Well, you
Lord
can be in the spiritual reign, but it's physically never been here. Has there ever been a time when everybody knows Hashem? That's not even going to occur during the millennium because it tells us that there will still be some death. And the last enemy to be defeated is death. So until the millennial kingdom is over, there's still going to be death. There's still going to be people who rebel against the Messiah even when he's here.
Well, I thought it was more phrased of everyone in the kingdom will know him from the least to the greatest. Not that anybody outside of the kingdom would know him from least to the greatest.
Well, the kingdom is here now. So it's here in your heart. It started, from the time Yeshua said, he said, this is the cup of the new covenant. So the kingdom is started now. I mean, when his cousin Yochanan or John the Immerser, he said, behold, the kingdom of God's, it's here now. It's here in the Messiah. But is it physically here for everybody? Not yet. But it's in stages of redemption, and it's not complete for all at this present time.
Okay. Yeah, I guess I just saw things like, people won't die. If they die at 100, they'll be considered a baby, things like that.
Correct. That's during the millennial kingdom.
Right. That when we actually see things like that, that's when the kingdom will actually, physically be here on the earth. And I always saw that as the millennial kingdom. So I see like that we're not actually there yet, but we still count ourselves as part of Israel if we believe, knowing that on that day we'll be raised incorruptible in the kingdom. And like I said earlier, the Egypt and the other nations will have to come up for the healing waters and the leaves and life.
So you have your citizenship card now saying that you're a part of the Commonwealth of Israel, but it's not fully realized yet.
Yeah, we have a.
But you already have your card.
Yeah, we have our passport, but we're in a different country than what our passport says we're citizens of.
Absolutely.
Like right now,
that's
we're
a good way to look at it. Somebody's got a lot of static on their mic.
All right, guys. So that was a good discussion. That was great. There were a lot of good questions that came up, and I think it's a good perspective from different, from different perspectives. There's good views of each perspective there. Certainly brings up a ton of other questions, I think, but
Sure.
But we're an hour and 38 minutes into it now, so we'll go ahead and cut it for today. Next week, we'll be back at it again. It looks like we either like this topic or like this time because we had quite a few people on. So if you have some people that would have some questions about this or some input, go ahead and invite them. We just always want to be respectful and always want to back up our positions with facts or wherever we're getting them from and not just, some empty apologetic. But that's all I got, Jackson. Are you talking, Jackson?
We can't hear you.
Can
Just
you hear
like
me
me.
now?
There you go.
Yeah. We have on the chat 71 notices, and this chat comes back with Zoom when we get off here. I have that available if anybody wants to go through that for next week and check out some of the questions and comments on there. And second thing, I just wanted to say tell you how much I love everybody that's on here today and how cool this has been. And I'm glad we're going to extend it for another week. So we'll see you all next week, 1 o'clock.
Sounds good.
Thank you. By the way, Sunday night, that's tomorrow night, the 9th, at 8 o'clock, for new students with the Yahad. We got about 6 of them, or maybe 8, just starting out. We're going to have a righteous judgment event, and that'll be on this same station, 8 o'clock Eastern time. It's a very good teaching, and it also is extremely practical. You can literally judge anything rightly through the eyes of Messiah. If you use this system, it's easy. It's something that'll help change your life. So that's tomorrow night. If you want to come on, you're welcome to. 8 p.m.
What time, Jackson?
What?
What time?
8 o'clock. So wish you all well. Enjoy the rest of your Shabbat. And we'll see you tomorrow, maybe.
Shabbat shalom.
Scott, Rich, great.